The thunderous crack of a whip cut through the dusty air of Redemption Creek like gunfire, followed by cruel laughter that made Hank Valens' hand instinctively move to the Colt revolver at his hip. He'd ridden into this small Montana town just an hour ago, seeking nothing more than a hot meal and a bed. But what he found instead made his blood run cold. In the shadow of the general store stood a crowd of jeering men surrounding a young woman with her head bowed, her trembling hands clutching a fallen basket of spilled goods. "Show us them scars again, Scarface Sally," one man taunted, reaching for her shawl. "Let's see what kind of monster's hiding underneath." The year was 1876, and the West was still as wild as the stories told back east. Hank had seen his fair share of cruelty in the decades since the war between the states ended. But something about this scene struck him different. Maybe it was the woman's quiet dignity, even as tears streamed down what he could see of her face. Or perhaps it was the simple injustice of grown men tormenting someone who clearly wanted nothing more than to disappear. Before he could think better of it, Hank was dismounting his chestnut stallion, the spurs on his worn boots jingling with each purposeful stride toward the commotion. "That's quite enough," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years riding with the Texas Rangers. At 32, Hank was neither young enough to be reckless nor old enough to be cautious, just experienced enough to be dangerous. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, revealing more of the woman they'd been tormenting. She was small in stature, dressed in a simple calico dress beneath her shawl, which had been partially pulled away to expose one side of her face and neck. Even from several paces away, Hank could see the angry red scars that marred her skin from just below her right eye down past her collar. "Mind your business, stranger," said a bulky man with a scraggly beard and tobacco-stained teeth. "This ain't your concern." "I'm making it my concern," Hank replied evenly, positioning himself between the woman and her tormentors. He noticed she'd stopped trying to gather her spilled goods and was instead watching him with a mixture of wariness and something else he couldn't quite place. Hope, perhaps. "Scarlett here's our local attraction," another man chimed in, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Folks pay good money at the traveling shows to see less impressive oddities." Hank's jaw tightened as he surveyed the group. 5 men, all looking like they worked the nearby ranches or mines. All looking like they'd had enough to drink to make them brave, but not enough to make them sloppy. A dangerous combination. "The lady has errands to finish," Hank said firmly. "I suggest you gentlemen find other entertainment." The bearded man stepped forward, squaring his shoulders. "And who might you be to give orders in our town?" Without taking his eyes off the man, Hank slowly pulled back his duster to reveal the silver star pinned to his vest. It wasn't strictly accurate he'd taken leave from the Rangers months ago, but these men didn't need to know that. "I'm the man suggesting you move along," he said quietly. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The West might be wild, but law was still respected, especially when backed by a reputation like the Rangers carried. The men muttered amongst themselves before dispersing, throwing dark looks over their shoulders as they retreated to the saloon across the street. When they were alone, Hank knelt to help the woman gather her scattered purchases. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25, with warm brown eyes that seemed at odds with the hardness of her expression. "I didn't need saving," she said, her voice surprisingly melodic despite the edge to her words. "Never said you did," Hank replied, picking up a tin of coffee and placing it in her basket. "But 5 against 1 seemed unfair odds, even for someone as fierce as you appear to be, Miss—" "Scarlett," she supplied after a moment's hesitation. "Scarlett Juarez." Hank nodded, offering his hand. "Hank Valens." She stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment before finally taking it, her touch light as a feather. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Valens, but I should warn you being seen with me won't do your reputation any favors in Redemption Creek." There was something in her tone that stirred something protective in Hank. He'd never been one to run from a fight, especially when it involved standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. "I rarely concern myself with reputations, Miss Juarez," he said, rising to his feet and offering her the filled basket. "Especially in towns I don't plan to stay in long." A flicker of what might have been disappointment crossed her face before she smoothed her expression. "Just passing through, then?" That was the plan. Hank glanced toward the saloon where her tormentors had disappeared. Though plans have been known to change. Scarlett adjusted her shawl to better cover her scars, a gesture Hank suspected was so habitual she didn't even realize she was doing it. Well, Mr. Valens, I appreciate your gallantry, misplaced though it may be. If you're looking for lodging, Mrs. Patterson runs a clean boarding house at the end of the street. The food's plain but filling. She turned to leave, but Hank gently caught her elbow. May I escort you home, Miss Juarez? Those men didn't strike me as the type to learn lessons easily. A complex series of emotions played across the visible side of her face. Suspicion, consideration, and something that might have been longing. Finally, she gave a curt nod. I live at the edge of town. It's not far, but the company would be appreciated. They walked in silence for several minutes, Hank leading his horse by the reins, while Scarlett kept a careful distance beside him. The main street of Redemption Creek gave way to scattered houses, and Hank noticed how people on porches and in yards would stop and stare as they passed, some whispering behind their hands. I take it this happens often, he observed quietly. Scarlett's shoulders stiffened. The staring or the mocking? Both. Often enough. Her voice was tight. 4 years is a long time, but not long enough for people to forget or forgive, apparently. Hank wanted to ask what there was to forgive, but something told him this wasn't the time. Instead, he asked, You've lived here that long? A bitter smile curved her lips. I was born here, left when I was 18, came back when I was 21. Changed. They approached a small but neat cabin set apart from the others, with a well-tended garden patch and chickens scratching in a side yard. It was modest, but showed care and attention to detail that spoke of pride. This is me, she said, pausing at the gate. Thank you for the escort, Mr. Valens. Hank tipped his hat. My pleasure, Miss Juarez. He was about to turn away when Scarlett spoke again, her voice softer now. Why did you help me today? The truth, please. I've had my fill of pity and false kindness. The directness of her question caught him off guard, but Hank had never been one to shy away from honesty. Because it was wrong, what they were doing, and because I've seen enough ugliness in this world to recognize beauty when it's trying to hide. Scarlett's eyes widened, and for a moment, Hank thought he'd overstepped. Then she gave him the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, small though it was. Mrs. Patterson serves supper at 6, she said. The stew on Tuesdays is particularly good. With that, she unlatched her gate and walked up the path to her door, not looking back even once. Hank watched her go, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Curiosity, certainly, but something more. As he led his horse toward the boarding house Scarlett had recommended, Hank realized his plans had indeed changed. Redemption Creek had just become more than a place to pass through. It had become a mystery to solve, centered around a scarred woman with defiant eyes and a garden that thrived despite the harsh Montana soil. The boarding house was exactly as Scarlett had described it, clean, modest, and run by a no-nonsense widow who eyed Hank's ranger badge with approval and his dusty clothes with considerably less enthusiasm. Rooms are $2 a week, payable in advance, Mrs. Patterson said, pushing a ledger across the counter for him to sign. That includes breakfast and supper, no drinking, no women, and no trouble. If you're here on official business, I'd prefer to know it up front. Hank signed the register and counted out the money. No official business, madam, just taking some time to rest before moving on. Mrs. Patterson harumphed, clearly not entirely convinced. Room 3, top of the stairs. Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late or you'll go hungry. Hank carried his saddlebags to the small but tidy room, noting the fresh linens and swept floor. After weeks of sleeping under the stars or in questionable saloon rooms, this was luxury indeed. He unpacked his few possessions, cleaned up at the washstand, and changed into his spare shirt before heading back downstairs. The dining room held a long table set for 8, though only 5 places were occupied when Hank entered. Mrs. Patterson, a traveling salesman, an elderly man who appeared to be a permanent resident, and a young couple who barely looked up from their whispered conversation. Hank took a seat near the head of the table, where Mrs. Patterson presided over a large pot of stew. The food was indeed good hearty beef and vegetable stew with fresh baked bread, and the conversation minimal, which suited Hank fine. He'd never been one for idle chatter, preferring to listen and observe. It wasn't until Mrs. Patterson was serving apple pie that she finally addressed him directly. "So, Ranger Valens, what brings you to our little town? We don't get many lawmen through here unless there's trouble." All eyes turned to him, and Hank carefully set down his fork. "Just Hank is fine, madam. I'm on leave from the Rangers at present. As for why I'm here, no particular reason. I'm heading to Oregon. Taking my time about it." Mrs. Patterson didn't look convinced. "Well, I should warn you, if you're planning to stay more than a night, that you were seen with Scarlett Juarez today." The young wife looked up sharply. "The scarred woman? George, that's the one I told you about, who lives alone at the edge of town." Her husband hushed her, but Mrs. Patterson continued undeterred. "People here have long memories, Mr. Valens. Associating with certain individuals can make your stay uncomfortable." Hank felt a flash of irritation, but kept his expression neutral. "I'm not in the habit of choosing my acquaintances based on town gossip, Mrs. Patterson." "It's not gossip," the elderly man spoke up, his voice creaky with age. "That girl brought fire and death to this town. Some things can't be forgiven." "Fire and death?" Hank repeated, his interest piqued despite himself. Mrs. Patterson shot the old man a warning look. "That's not dinner conversation, Mr. Finch. What's done is done, and we don't speak of it." But the old man seemed determined. She was wild from the start, that one. Her mother was a Mexican healer who married the blacksmith, James Juarez. Good man, James. But that girl had her mother's hot blood. When she ran off with that gambler at 18, everyone said no good would come of it. "Mr. Finch," Mrs. Patterson said sharply, "that's quite enough." The old man subsided, muttering into his pie, but the damage was done. The salesman and the young couple were now openly staring at Hank with renewed interest. "I apologize for Mr. Finch," Mrs. Patterson said stiffly. "He forgets himself sometimes. More pie, Mr. Valens?" Hank declined, his appetite gone. After helping clear the table as a gesture of goodwill, he excused himself to step outside for some air. The evening was cooling rapidly, stars beginning to pepper the darkening sky as he lit a cigarette and leaned against the porch railing. The conversation at dinner had only deepened the mystery surrounding Scarlett Juarez. Fire and death, the old man had said. What had happened 4 years ago that had left her scarred and the town unforgiving? And why had she returned to a place that clearly despised her? He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the approach of boots on the boardwalk until a voice spoke beside him. "Ranger?" Hank turned to find the bearded man from earlier standing a few feet away, flanked by 2 others from the group that had been tormenting Scarlett. "Evening," Hank said calmly, dropping his cigarette and grinding it out with his boot. "Something I can help you with?" The bearded man took a step closer. "Name's Burke. I run the livery here in town." "Mr. Burke." Hank nodded but didn't offer his hand. "Wanted to apologize for earlier. Didn't realize you were a ranger." Burke's tone suggested he was more sorry about the badge than the behavior. "We were just having some fun with Scarlett. No real harm meant." "Looked like harm to me," Hank replied evenly, "and I'm not sure the lady found it amusing." Burke exchanged glances with his companions. "You're new here, so you don't understand. That woman's not what she seems. There's a reason folks in Redemption Creek keep their distance. I'm not much interested in town grudges, Mr. Burke." "You should be." Burke's voice hardened. "Last outsider who took an interest in Scarlett Juarez ended up dead. Terrible accident." His emphasis on the word accident made it clear it had been anything but. Hank straightened, his hand casually moving closer to his revolver. "Sounds like you're trying to tell me something." "Just offering friendly advice." Burke spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Redemption Creek's a peaceful town. We like to keep it that way. You're welcome to stay as long as you like, Ranger, but I'd recommend keeping your distance from that woman, for your own good." With that, Burke tipped his hat and sauntered away, his friends following closely behind. Hank watched them go, turning their words over in his mind. It was clearly a warning, but it had the opposite effect than intended. Rather than discourage his interest in Scarlett Juarez, it only strengthened his resolve to uncover the truth. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the promise of heat later in the day. Hank rose early, taking breakfast with Mrs. Patterson and the other boarders before heading out to explore the town properly. Redemption Creek was larger than it had first appeared, with a main street boasting the typical establishment's general store, saloon, bank, hotel, and various shops and several side streets of homes and smaller businesses. He stopped at the livery to check on his horse and found a stable boy tending to the animals instead of Burke. The telegraph office next door provided an opportunity to send a message to his former captain in the Rangers, requesting any information that might be available on Redemption Creek and specifically events from 4 years ago. It was nearly noon when Hank found himself outside the general store, ostensibly examining a display of new Winchesters, but actually watching the street. His patience was rewarded when he spotted Scarlett approaching from the north end of town, basket in hand and shawl firmly in place despite the growing heat. She noticed him immediately. Hank was not a man easily overlooked, standing 6'3" with broad shoulders and a bearing that commanded attention, but gave no indication of recognition beyond a slight hesitation in her step. As she neared the store, Hank touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Miss Juarez." Scarlett paused, glancing around as if to see who might be watching them. "Mr. Valens, I see you decided to stay another day." "The accommodations proved satisfactory," he said with a small smile. "Mrs. Patterson runs a tight ship." "That she does." Scarlett seemed to be debating something internally before adding, "I'm surprised to see you out and about. Usually by now, someone would have warned you about the dangers of associating with me." Hank's smile widened slightly. "Someone did. Several someones, in fact." That caught her off guard. "And yet, here you are." "Here I am," he agreed. "I've never been good at taking warnings to heart. Stubborn, my mother called it." A ghost of a smile touched Scarlett's lips before vanishing. "Stubborn is dangerous in Redemption Creek, Mr. Valens. So I've gathered. But I've faced worse dangers than small-town gossip." She studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I need to purchase supplies. Would you care to accompany me? The store owner tends to be more fair with his pricing when I'm not alone." The simple request and the vulnerability it revealed touched something in Hank. "I'd be honored." Inside the general store, the atmosphere was noticeably tense. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetual frown, watched Scarlett like she might pocket his merchandise at any moment. Other customers either ignored her completely or stared openly at the shawl covering her scars. Hank stayed close as Scarlett efficiently gathered her items: flour, sugar, coffee, a spool of thread, and several other necessities. When she approached the counter, the proprietor made a show of examining each item carefully before announcing the total. "That'll be $3.75. Scarlett's body tensed, and Hank could tell the price was inflated. Before she could protest, he placed $4 on the counter. "Keep the change," he said, gathering the packages. "Good day to you, sir." Outside, Scarlett turned to him with fire in her eyes. "I didn't ask you to pay for my goods." "I know," Hank replied calmly. "Consider it an apology for interfering. Was that more than you usually pay?" Her anger deflated slightly. "About $1 more. Mr. Wilson always finds a way to charge me extra. Says it's for the trouble my presence causes his other customers." The casual injustice of it made Hank's blood boil, but he kept his expression neutral. What trouble would that be? Exactly. Scarlett began walking, and Hank fell into step beside her, still carrying her packages. The trouble of reminding them that bad things happen even in places like Redemption Creek, that their perfect little town isn't so perfect after all. They walked in silence for a few moments before Hank spoke again. "I heard some talk at the boarding house about a fire." Scarlett stopped so abruptly that Hank nearly walked into her. When she turned to face him, her eyes were cold. "Is that why you're being kind to me, Ranger? Investigating old crimes?" "No," Hank said firmly. "I'm not here in any official capacity. I'm just trying to understand why a town would turn against one of its own." She searched his face for any sign of deception, then abruptly continued walking. "If you want to know about the fire, you could ask anyone in town. They all have their versions of the story. Most end with me being responsible for 8 deaths. Hank felt a chill despite the midday heat. "And what's your version?" Scarlett walked several more paces before responding, her voice so quiet Hank had to lean closer to hear. My version doesn't matter. It never did. They had reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scattered homesteads. Ahead, Hank could see Scarlett's small cabin with its neat garden. It matters to me, he said, surprising himself with the realization that it was true. Scarlett stopped at her gate, finally turning to face him fully. For the first time, she made no attempt to ensure her shawl covered her scars. They ran from her right temple down her cheek and neck, disappearing beneath her collar-burned scars. Hank now realized, puckered and angry against her otherwise smooth skin. Why? She asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Why would it matter to you what happened to me? Hank considered his answer carefully. Because I've spent my life trying to find truth and justice in a world that often has little of either, and because something tells me you've had precious little of both. Scarlett stared at him for a long moment, then took her packages from his arms. Come back tomorrow at noon, if you're still interested in my version. I can't promise you'll believe it, but I can promise it will be the truth. Without waiting for his response, she unlatched her gate and walked to her door, disappearing inside without a backward glance. Hank stood watching the closed door for several minutes, feeling as though he'd just been issued both a challenge and an invitation. The rest of the day passed slowly. Hank checked at the telegraph office, but no reply had come from his former captain yet. He spent some time at the saloon, nursing a whiskey and listening to the conversations around him, hoping to glean more information about Redemption Creek and the mysterious fire, but the locals clammed up whenever he approached. That evening, he declined supper at the boarding house, instead taking his meal at the hotel restaurant where he might attract less attention. The food was mediocre, but the view of the street excellent, allowing him to observe the comings and goings of the townspeople as night fell. As he was finishing his coffee, the chair across from him scraped back, and a man dropped into it without invitation. He was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair and the weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. Sheriff Thomas Miller, the man introduced himself, extending a hand. Heard we had a ranger in town. Hank shook the offered hand. Hank Valens, though as I've told others, I'm currently on leave. Miller nodded, signaling the waitress for coffee. Leave or not, when a man with a reputation like yours shows up in my town, I take notice, especially when that man starts asking questions about old tragedies. So his inquiries hadn't gone unnoticed. Hank leaned back in his chair, studying the sheriff. Just trying to understand the lay of the land, Sheriff. People here seem mighty upset about something that happened 4 years ago. Miller's coffee arrived, and he took his time adding sugar before responding. The Redemption Creek fire wasn't just something that happened, Valens. It was the worst tragedy this town has ever seen. 8 people dead, including 2 children. Half the main street burned to the ground before we could contain it. And Scarlett Juarez was involved? The sheriff's eyes narrowed. So that's your interest. I should have guessed when Burke told me about your intervention yesterday. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, what happened with Scarlett is complicated. There was no formal charge against her, if that's what you're asking. Not enough evidence. But this is a small town, and people need someone to blame when bad things happen. And she was convenient, Hank supplied. She was suspicious, Miller corrected. A young woman returns to town after 3 years away, severely burned. On the same night, a fire breaks out that kills 8 people, including the husband who supposedly abandoned her. It doesn't take a detective to connect those dots. Hank frowned. Her husband died in the fire? Ex-husband, technically, Emmett Blackwell. Professional gambler, occasional gunslinger, full-time bastard. He left town with Scarlett when she was 18, brought her back 3 years later, looking like she'd been through hell, then died in the fire that same night. Draw your own conclusions. The name Blackwell stirred something in Hank's memory. A wanted poster, perhaps. Or a name mentioned in dispatches. He'd have to think on it later. If there wasn't enough evidence to charge her, why does the town treat her like a pariah? Miller drained his coffee and stood. Because sometimes the law requires evidence. But people's hearts don't. Word of advice, Valens? Whatever you think you're doing with Scarlett Juarez, be careful. That woman carries bad luck, like some carry a pocket watch. He tossed a coin on the table for his coffee. Enjoy the rest of your stay in Redemption Creek. Hank watched him go, turning over this new information in his mind. The sheriff hadn't exactly been forthcoming, but he'd provided enough pieces to start forming a picture. Scarlett had left town young with a man named Blackwell, returned years later with burn scars, and that same night, a fire had killed 8 people, including Blackwell himself. It was a compelling circumstantial case for revenge, perhaps, but Hank had seen enough injustice in his time to know that circumstances could be misleading. What had really happened that night? And what had happened to Scarlett during those 3 years away? The next day dawned with dark clouds gathering on the horizon, promising rain by afternoon. Hank rose early, checked again at the telegraph office, still no response, and then spent the morning walking the town, trying to identify where the fire might have occurred. It wasn't difficult. Although 4 years had passed, the newer buildings on the east side of Main Street stood out clearly against their weathered neighbors. As noon approached, Hank made his way toward Scarlett's cabin, stopping at the general store to purchase a bottle of decent whiskey as a gift. He wasn't entirely sure she would welcome him, despite her invitation, and he'd found over the years that good liquor often smoothed awkward social situations. The first fat raindrops were beginning to fall as he approached her gate, and by the time he reached her door, the sky had opened up in earnest. Hank knocked firmly, water running from the brim of his hat down the back of his duster. The door opened to reveal Scarlett, dressed simply in a blue calico dress, with her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. For once, she wore no shawl, her scars fully visible in the soft light from inside the cabin. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I said I would." Hank removed his hat, shaking off the rain. "Though I brought reinforcements, just in case." He held up the whiskey bottle. A small smile touched her lips. "A wise precaution. Come in before you drown." The interior of Scarlett's cabin was modest but comfortable, with a main room containing a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, and a sitting area near the hearth where a fire crackled welcomingly. A door presumably led to a bedroom at the back. Everything was meticulously clean and organized, with touches that spoke of a woman trying to make a real home, a colorful quilt over the back of a chair, dried flowers arranged in a pottery vase, shelves lined with books. "You can hang your coat by the fire," Scarlett said, taking the whiskey and retrieving 2 glasses from a cupboard. "I made stew. I thought you might be hungry after your walk in the rain." The simple hospitality touched Hank more than he expected. "That's mighty kind of you, Miss Juarez." "Scarlett, please," she said, pouring 2 modest measures of whiskey. "If we're going to discuss my sordid past, we might as well be on a first-name basis." Hank accepted the glass she offered, raising it slightly. "To truth, then." Something flickered in her eyes, fear perhaps, or resignation. "To truth," she echoed, taking a small sip. They sat at the table, where Scarlett had already laid out 2 bowls of hearty stew and a loaf of fresh bread. For a few minutes, they ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the rain pattering on the roof and the occasional crack of the fire. Finally, Scarlett set down her spoon and looked directly at him. "What have you heard about the fire?" Hank wiped his mouth with a napkin before answering. "That it happened the night you returned to Redemption Creek. That 8 people died, including your former husband. That many believe you were responsible, though no charges were filed." She nodded slowly. "That's the bare bones of it, yes. Did they tell you why I would have started such a fire?" "Revenge was implied, against your husband." "Ex-husband," she corrected automatically, then sighed. "Emmett and I were married for less than a year before I realized what kind of man he truly was. By then, we were far from Redemption Creek, and I had nowhere to go." Hank remained silent, giving her space to continue her story at her own pace. "We traveled a lot, Emmett and I. He was a gambler, and not a particularly honest one. We'd stay in a town until he'd fleeced enough locals, or until someone caught on to his cheating, then move on quickly." She traced a finger around the rim of her whiskey glass. "He had a temper. At first, he'd just shout when he lost. But eventually, he started using his fists." The matter-of-fact way she said it made Hank's stomach clench. He'd seen too many women trapped in such situations, with no resources and nowhere to turn. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked softly. Scarlett laughed without humor. "He kept all the money, watched me constantly, and he made it very clear what would happen if I tried to run." She touched her scarred cheek absently. Besides, where would I go? Back here, where everyone had warned me against him? Where I'd have to admit they were right and I was a fool? She took another sip of whiskey, larger this time. So I stayed. For 3 years I stayed. We moved from town to town across Montana, Wyoming, even up into Canada for a while. And then we ended up in a mining camp called Bitter Creek. Hank felt a chill. He knew that name. 2 years ago, he'd been part of a ranger contingent sent to investigate reports of a massive fire that had destroyed most of the camp. Over 30 people had died. "You were at Bitter Creek?" he asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Scarlett's eyes widened. "You know of it?" "I was part of the investigation afterward. We never determined exactly how the fire started. There were rumors of a mining dispute that got out of hand." She nodded slowly. "That's the story that spread. It wasn't the whole truth." She took a deep breath. Emmett had started a high-stakes poker game with some of the mine owners. He was winning cheating, of course, and tensions were running high. I was serving drinks as usual. One of the miners accused Emmett of cheating, and everything exploded. Guns were drawn, a lamp was knocked over, and within minutes, the whole place was ablaze. Scarlett's voice had taken on a distant quality, as if she were seeing it all happen again before her eyes. "I tried to help people get out, but the fire spread so quickly. The whole camp was mostly wooden structures, built too close together. It was..." She shuddered. "It was hell." "And that's how you were burned," Hank said quietly. She nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to her scarred cheek. "A burning beam fell. I was trapped for a while before someone pulled me out. By then, the damage was done." "I'm sorry," Hank said, meaning it. "But I don't understand how you ended up back in Redemption Creek, or how another fire happened the same night." Scarlett rose from the table, moving to stare out the window at the rain. "I spent weeks recovering in a makeshift hospital. I thought Emmett had died and the fire hoped it even. But then he showed up one day, acting like a concerned husband. He'd survived with barely a scratch." Her voice hardened. "He said we needed to leave, that people were asking questions about how the fire started. He was worried they'd figure out his role in it." She turned back to face Hank, her expression grim. "I refused to go with him. For the first time in years, I stood up to him. I told him I was going home to Redemption Creek, with or without him. I thought he might kill me then and there, but instead, he just smiled that terrible smile of his and said he'd take me home himself." The rain was coming down harder now, drumming on the roof as Scarlett continued her story. "We arrived in Redemption Creek late at night. Emmett insisted we stay at the hotel rather than go to my parents' home. They died while I was away. But I still own their house, this house. I was exhausted from the journey and didn't argue." She returned to the table, refilling their whiskey glasses with a hand that trembled slightly. "I fell asleep almost immediately. When I woke, Emmett was gone, and I could smell smoke. The hotel was already burning. I barely made it out alive. Again." Hank leaned forward. "You're saying Emmett started the fire at the hotel?" "I know he did," Scarlett said firmly. "He'd been furious all the way from Bitter Creek, talking about how I'd ruined everything, how I'd pay for defying him. I think he meant for me to die in that fire, to finish what Bitter Creek started. But he died instead," Hank said, the pieces falling into place. "Along with 7 others." Scarlett nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "They found his body in the hallway outside our room. The official story was that he was trying to save others. But I know the truth. He was coming back to make sure I didn't escape." "Did you tell the sheriff this?" Hank asked. "Of course I did. But who would believe me? A scarred woman with wild tales about her husband starting 2 deadly fires. Against the word of respected citizens who'd seen me arguing with Emmett earlier that day, threatening him." She laughed bitterly. "It was easier for everyone to blame the outsider, the woman who'd run away and come back changed." Hank sat back, processing her story. It had the ring of truth to it, and it filled in gaps in the Bitter Creek investigation that had always bothered him. But something still wasn't quite right. "If the sheriff didn't believe you, why weren't you charged? From what I've gathered, the whole town thinks you're guilty." Scarlett's expression turned guarded. "There was someone who spoke for me. Someone who believed my story and convinced Sheriff Miller to let me be. Who? She hesitated, then sighed. Dr. Elias Hartman. He was new to town then, had only been here a few months. He treated my burns after the hotel fire, and he believed me. Said the pattern of Emmett's injuries suggested he was heading toward our room, not away from it. The name was familiar. The doctor still in town? No, Scarlett said, her voice soft with what might have been regret. He left about a year after the fire. The town made it clear they didn't appreciate him taking my side. And yet you stayed, Hank observed. Why remain in a place where everyone thinks you're a murderer? Scarlett gestured around the small cabin. Where else would I go? This is my home, the only property I own. My parents are buried here, and running once only made things worse. She straightened her shoulders. Besides, leaving would feel like admitting guilt. They lapsed into silence as the rain continued to fall outside. Hank studied Scarlett across the table, seeing her in a new light. The defensive, wary woman he'd first met was still there, but now he understood the strength it took for her to face this town every day, to endure their scorn and cruelty rather than flee. Thank you, he said finally, for trusting me with your story. Scarlett met his gaze directly. Do you believe me? It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Hank had spent years learning to read people, to separate truth from lies, and everything in him said Scarlett was being honest. But he'd also been fooled before, and the stakes here were high, 8 deaths in Redemption Creek, 30 more at Bitter Creek. I believe you believe it, he said carefully. And I believe there's more to investigate before anyone can say for certain what happened that night. She nodded, accepting his diplomatic answer. Fair enough, it's more consideration than most have given me. They finished their meal with lighter conversation, Hank telling stories of his more amusing adventures with the Rangers while Scarlett spoke of her garden and her plans to expand it. By the time the rain began to ease, Hank felt a connection to this scarred, resilient woman that he couldn't quite explain. As he prepared to leave, Scarlett handed him his now dry hat and duster. Thank you for listening, she said quietly. It's been a long time since anyone wanted to hear my side. I'm not done listening, Hank replied, or investigating. If what you say is true, you've been wronged twice over by your husband and by this town. A spark of something like hope flickered in Scarlett's eyes, but she quickly tamped it down. Don't make promises you can't keep, Ranger. Redemption Creek doesn't change its mind easily. Neither do I, Hank said, settling his hat on his head. I'll call again tomorrow, if that's all right. Scarlett hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. As Hank walked back toward town through the muddy streets, he turned over everything he'd learned. Scarlett's story was compelling. But he needed more than her word to convince a town that had already made up its mind. He needed evidence, witnesses, something concrete that would support her version of events. The telegraph office was his first stop. To his satisfaction, a response from his former captain had finally arrived. Blackwell Emmett, stop wanted Colorado. Wyoming fraud, assault, stop suspected. Arson Bitter Creek, stop believed. Deceased, stop. Proceed with caution, stop. The confirmation that Emmett Blackwell had been suspected of arson at Bitter Creek lent credibility to Scarlett's story. It wasn't proof, but it was a start. Hank's next stop was the sheriff's office, where he found Miller cleaning his shotgun. Back again, Valens? The sheriff asked without looking up. I figured you'd be moving on after our chat. I've never been good at taking hints, Hank replied, settling into a chair across from the desk. I spoke with Scarlett Juarez today. Miller's hand stilled momentarily before resuming their work. I figured you might. Get an earful about how she's innocent and her husband was the real villain? Something like that, Hank acknowledged. I'm curious about something, Sheriff. Did you know Emmett Blackwell was wanted in 2 states before the fire? That got Miller's full attention. What are you implying? Just wondering how thoroughly you investigated all possibilities. Blackwell had a history of violence, fraud, and possibly arson. Seems relevant to a case involving a suspicious fire. Miller set down the shotgun with deliberate care. Listen, Valens, I did my job. I investigated every angle of that fire. Yes, Blackwell had a shady past, most gamblers do. But the witness statements all pointed to an argument between him and Scarlett earlier that day. She was heard threatening him. Witnesses can be mistaken, Hank said mildly, or influenced by existing biases. The sheriff's expression hardened. You've been in town, 3 days? And suddenly you think you understand everything about a case I spent months investigating? Dr. Hartman had the same attitude, and look where it got him run out of town for defending a killer. Hank filed away that confirmation of Scarlett's claim about the doctor. I'm not claiming to understand everything, Sheriff. I'm just asking questions, like why a woman with severe burn scars would choose fire as her method of revenge. Or why she'd return to the scene of the crime immediately afterward instead of fleeing. Miller stood abruptly. I don't have to justify my investigation to you, Ranger. On leave or not, you have no authority here. Now, if you don't mind, I have actual work to do. Hank recognized the dismissal, but wasn't quite ready to leave. One more question, if you don't mind. The survivors of the fire, have any of them ever expressed doubts about what they saw that night? Something flickered across Miller's face, discomfort, perhaps, or uncertainty. Mrs. Whitley lost her husband and son in that fire. Mr. Peterson his daughter and grandson. They don't talk about that night, and I'd appreciate if you didn't go stirring up painful memories for them. It wasn't exactly an answer, but it gave Hank names to pursue. He stood, tipping his hat. Appreciate your time, Sheriff. I'll let you get back to your work. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets muddy but navigable. Hank spent the rest of the afternoon making discreet inquiries about Mrs. Whitley and Mr. Peterson, learning that the former still ran the town's small bakery, while the latter had moved to the outskirts of town after the fire, becoming something of a recluse. The bakery was his first stop the next morning. A bell tinkled softly as he entered the warm, fragrant space. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s, her graying hair neatly pinned up, her hands dusted with flour as she arranged fresh rolls in a display case. Good morning, she greeted him with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. What can I get for you today? Whatever smells so good, Hank replied, returning her smile. I'm new in town, Hank Valens. Martha Whitley, she introduced herself, selecting a cinnamon roll from the case. Passing through, Mr. Valens. That was the plan, but I've found myself intrigued by Redemption Creek. He accepted the roll, paying for it with a coin that he insisted she keep in full, despite her protests that it was too much. I've been hearing stories about the town's history, including the fire a few years back. Mrs. Whitley's expression shuddered immediately. That's not a topic we discuss with strangers, Mr. Valens. I understand, Hank said gently, and I apologize for bringing up painful memories. I lost family in a fire myself, years ago. I know the wounds never truly heal. Something in his tone must have reached her, because Mrs. Whitley's rigid posture softened slightly. It's been 4 years, but sometimes it feels like yesterday. My Robert and little James... She trailed off, her eyes distant. You were there that night? Hank asked after a respectful pause. She nodded, mechanically wiping her hands on her apron. We had a room on the second floor. Robert woke me. The hallway was already full of smoke. He went to get James from the adjoining room while I opened the window for air. I heard them coming back, and then... Her voice broke. Then there was a crash. Part of the ceiling collapsed. I called for them, but there was no answer. A man pulled me out through the window onto the porch roof. I never saw my husband or son again. I'm so sorry, Hank said, meaning it. Whatever had happened that night, the pain of those who had lost loved ones was real and deserved respect. Mrs. Whitley dabbed at her eyes with her apron. They say time heals all wounds, but some wounds just scab over. They never truly close. Did you ever meet Scarlett Juarez? Hank asked carefully. Before or after the fire? The woman's expression hardened again. I knew who she was, the blacksmith's wild daughter who ran off with that gambler. When I heard she'd returned to town the very night of the fire, she shook her head. It was too much of a coincidence. Did you see her that night, during the fire? Mrs. Whitley hesitated, her brow furrowing. No, not during. But afterwards she was outside, watching the hotel burn. She didn't even look upset, just stood there, clutching that shawl around her, those terrible scars visible in the firelight. It wasn't much, but it was interesting that Mrs. Whitley hadn't actually seen Scarlett do anything suspicious that night. "Thank you for speaking with me," Hank said, preparing to leave. "Your rolls are excellent, by the way." He was nearly to the door when Mrs. Whitley called after him. "Mr. Valens, there was something odd that night, something I told Sheriff Miller, but he said it wasn't important." Hank turned back. "What was that, madam?" "Before the fire, when everything was quiet, I heard arguing in the hallway. A man and a woman. The man said something like, 'You'll regret crossing me.' I assumed it was just hotel guests having a spat. It was only later I wondered if it might have been the Juarez woman and her husband." "Did you recognize the voices?" She shook her head. "No. But there's something else? The doctor, Dr. Hartman, he came to see me a few weeks after the fire, asked a lot of questions about what I heard that night. He seemed troubled by something." "Do you know where Dr. Hartman went when he left town?" Hank asked, a new line of inquiry opening in his mind. "Denver, I believe. He had family there." Mrs. Whitley's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Why are you so interested in all this, Mr. Valens? It's ancient history now." "Not to everyone," Hank replied simply. "Thank you again for your time, Mrs. Whitley." His next stop was the telegraph office, where he sent another message to his former captain, requesting information on the whereabouts of Dr. Elias Hartman, last known to be in Denver. If the doctor had doubts about the official story of the fire, his testimony could be crucial. Finding Mr. Peterson proved more challenging. His isolated cabin was a good hour's ride from town, and when Hank finally arrived, he was greeted by a shotgun pointed through a barely open door. "State your business," growled a voice from within. "Hank Valens, sir," Hank replied calmly, keeping his hands visible. "I'm looking into some old matters in Redemption Creek and was hoping to speak with you briefly." "Not interested," came the reply, followed by the door starting to close. "It's about the hotel fire," Hank said quickly. "About what really happened that night." The door paused, then opened slightly wider, revealing a gaunt man with a wild beard and suspicious eyes. "What do you know about that night?" "Not enough," Hank admitted. "That's why I'm here. I've heard your side of the story wasn't fully considered." That seemed to catch Peterson off guard. After a moment's consideration, he lowered the shotgun and stepped back. "Come in then, but make it quick. I don't much care for company these days." The interior of the cabin was dim and cluttered, with newspapers stacked in corners and unwashed dishes piled in a basin. Peterson gestured Hank to a rickety chair before settling into another across from him, the shotgun resting across his knees. "What's your interest in the fire?" Peterson demanded without preamble. Hank chose his words carefully. "I believe there may have been a miscarriage of justice, that perhaps the wrong person was blamed." Peterson's laugh was harsh and humorless. "You mean the Juarez woman? You're barking up the wrong tree, mister. She's guilty as sin." "Did you see her start the fire?" Hank asked directly. "I didn't need to see it," Peterson snapped. "My daughter and grandson died in that hotel. Someone has to pay for that. With respect, sir, someone paying isn't the same as justice being served. Did you actually witness anything suspicious that night? Anything that directly implicated Scarlett Juarez?" Peterson's fingers tightened on the shotgun. "I saw her with Blackwell earlier that day. They were arguing outside the saloon. She looked ready to kill him." "But did you see her during or immediately before the fire?" The old man's certainty seemed to waver. No. I was asleep when it started. Woke to screaming and smoke. By the time I got out, the whole place was an inferno." His voice broke. "My Caroline and little Matthew were in the room next to mine. I tried to reach them, but the hallway collapsed." Hank leaned forward. "Mr. Peterson, I'm truly sorry for your loss. And I understand the need to have someone to blame. But what if it wasn't Scarlett Juarez? What if it was Emmett Blackwell himself who started that fire?" Peterson's head snapped up. "Blackwell? Why would he burn down a hotel with himself inside?" "Maybe he didn't mean to die," Hank suggested. "Maybe the fire spread faster than he anticipated. Or maybe he was trying to make sure his wife didn't escape." The old man fell silent, considering this possibility. Finally, he spoke in a quieter voice. "Dr. Hartman came to see me once, said he had doubts about the official story, said Blackwell's body was found near the Juarez woman's room, not trying to escape." He shook his head. "I didn't want to hear it then. Was easier to blame her." "And now?" Hank prompted gently. Peterson sighed, suddenly looking every one of his years. Now, I just want peace. If that means learning my hatred has been misplaced all these years, well, that's a heavy thing to consider. Before leaving, Hank asked one more question. Did you ever see Scarlett Juarez before the fire, when she first arrived in town with Blackwell? Peterson nodded slowly. Briefly, they checked into the hotel late. I was in the lobby, couldn't sleep. She looked broken somehow, kept her face covered, flinched when Blackwell touched her arm. I remember thinking it was strange, but then figured it wasn't my business. It was another small piece of the puzzle, another detail that aligned with Scarlett's version of events rather than the town's. Hank thanked Peterson for his time and rode back to Redemption Creek with a growing conviction that Scarlett had been telling the truth. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Hank would spend mornings investigating, speaking with anyone who had been present the night of the fire or who knew Scarlett and Emmett Blackwell. In the afternoons, he would visit Scarlett, sharing what he'd learned and getting to know the woman behind the scars. With each passing day, Hank found himself more drawn to Scarlett's quiet strength and resilience. She never complained about her treatment by the townspeople, though it clearly hurt her. Instead, she focused on her garden, her books, and her small acts of kindness toward those few who would accept them, like leaving fresh vegetables on the doorsteps of families she knew were struggling. On the 5th day after their initial conversation about the fire, Hank arrived at Scarlett's cabin to find her sitting on the porch, a letter in her hands and tears streaming down her face. "Scarlett?" he asked, alarmed. "What's happened?" She looked up, seeming almost surprised to see him, then hastily wiped at her tears. "Nothing? It's nothing." Hank sat beside her on the porch step. "Doesn't look like nothing." After a moment's hesitation, she handed him the letter. "It's from Dr. Hartman. He's coming back to Redemption Creek." Hank scanned the letter quickly. In it, Hartman explained that he had received Hank's telegraph and was returning to set the record straight about the fire. He believed he had evidence that would exonerate Scarlett once and for all. "This is good news," Hank said, confused by her tears. "Isn't it?" Scarlett took back the letter, folding it carefully. "It's unexpected. Elias Doctor." Hartman was the only person in this town who showed me kindness after the fire. He risked his reputation to defend me, and then he left. There was something in her voice when she spoke the doctor's name that made Hank wonder if there had been more between them than professional concern. The thought produced an unexpected twinge of jealousy. "Were you and the doctor close?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Scarlett glanced at him, a small, sad smile on her lips. "He asked me to go with him when he left, said we could start fresh in Denver, away from the whispers and accusations." "But you stayed," Hank observed. "I stayed," she agreed. "I couldn't run again, and I wasn't ready for what he was offering." Relief washed over Hank, followed immediately by guilt. What right did he have to feel relieved? He barely knew this woman, would likely be moving on himself once this mystery was resolved. And yet, the thought of her with someone else, even someone who had defended her when no one else would stirred something possessive in him that he hadn't felt in years. "When does he arrive?" Hank asked, steering the conversation back to safer ground. "Tomorrow's stage, according to the letter." Scarlett stood, smoothing her skirts. "I should prepare. If he really has evidence that could clear my name." She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. Hank could see the mixture of hope and fear in her eyes. Hope that she might finally be vindicated. Fear that it might somehow go wrong again. "I'll be there," he promised. "Whatever happens, you won't face it alone." Scarlett studied his face for a long moment, then reached out to touch his cheek gently. "Why are you doing all this, Hank? You could have ridden on days ago, left Redemption Creek and its troubles behind." It was a question Hank had been asking himself with increasing frequency. Why had he stayed? Why had he invested so much time and energy into clearing the name of a woman he'd met only a week ago? The answer came to him with sudden clarity as he looked into her questioning eyes. "Because from the moment I saw you standing up to those men with your head held high, even as they mocked your scars, I knew you were something special, something worth fighting for." Scarlett's breath caught, and for a heartbeat, Hank thought he might have overstepped. Then she smiled a real smile that transformed her face and made the scars seem to fade into insignificance. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me. Not just my scars or my past, but me." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Hank found himself leaning closer, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Scarlett didn't pull away, her eyes holding his with a vulnerability that made his heart ache. A distant roll of thunder broke the spell. Scarlett stepped back, glancing at the darkening sky. "Another storm coming? You should head back to town before it hits." Hank nodded, reluctantly rising to his feet. "Tomorrow, then. For the stage." "Tomorrow," she agreed softly. As Hank walked back toward town, he found himself hoping that Dr. Hartman's evidence would indeed clear Scarlett's name, while also hoping that whatever had once been between Scarlett and the doctor was truly in the past. The stage was due at noon, and by 11:30 the next day, Hank was already waiting at the depot, watching as Scarlett approached from the direction of her cabin. She'd dressed with care, he noticed, wearing a green dress he hadn't seen before, and with her hair arranged in a more elaborate style than usual. She still wore her shawl, though, the scars visible only on one side of her face. "You look nice," he said, as she joined him on the platform. A flush rose in her cheeks. "Thank you. It seemed important to make an effort for Elias." The use of the doctor's first name sent another twinge through Hank, but he pushed it aside. "Nervous?" "Terrified," she admitted with a small laugh. What if his evidence isn't enough? What if the town still refuses to believe the truth? "One step at a time," Hank advised. Though he shared her concerns. Redemption Creek had clung to its narrative about Scarlett for 4 years. It wouldn't be easily swayed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats and wheels announced the stage's arrival. It rolled into town in a cloud of dust, the driver reining in the horses with practiced skill before the depot. As the door opened and passengers began to disembark, Hank felt Scarlett tense beside him. The first passengers were a family with small children, followed by a traveling salesman, and then finally a tall man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard stepped down, scanning the platform until his gaze landed on Scarlett. "Scarlett," he said, his voice warm with affection as he approached. "You look well." "Elias," she replied, accepting his brief embrace. "It's good to see you. This is Hank Valens, the man who contacted you." Dr. Hartman turned to Hank, extending his hand. "Dr. Elias Hartman, I appreciate your interest in this matter, Mr. Valens. Your telegram suggested you have doubts about the official account of the fire?" "More than doubts," Hank replied, shaking the offered hand. "I've been investigating for the past week, and I believe Scarlett's version of events is the truth." The doctor nodded, retrieving his bags from the stage. "As do I, always have, but now I have more than belief to offer. I have evidence. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere private?" They ended up at Scarlett's cabin, where she prepared tea while Hartman unpacked several documents from his valise. Hank found himself studying the doctor, trying to take his measure. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with an intelligent face and kind eyes behind his spectacles. His manner toward Scarlett was respectful but affectionate, confirming Hank's suspicion that there had been feelings between them, at least on the doctor's part. "So," Hartman began once they were settled at Scarlett's table, "I understand you're a Texas Ranger, Mr. Valens?" "On leave," Hank clarified. "I was passing through Redemption Creek when I witnessed some locals harassing Scarlett. My interest in the fire came later, as I learned more about the town's history." Hartman nodded thoughtfully. "And what have you discovered in your investigation?" Hank outlined what he'd learned from Scarlett's account of her life with Blackwell and the Bitter Creek fire to his interviews with Mrs. Whitley, Mr. Peterson, and others who had been present the night of the Redemption Creek fire. He also mentioned the Telegraph confirming Blackwell's criminal history and suspected involvement in arson. "That aligns with what I suspected," Hartman said when Hank finished. "But there's more." He spread several documents on the table. "After I left Redemption Creek, I continued to look into Emmett Blackwell's background. What I found was disturbing, to say the least." He picked up a wanted poster, showing a sketch that bore a clear resemblance to Blackwell. He was suspected of involvement in at least 3 other fires before Bitter Creek, all in establishments where he'd been gambling and all occurring after disputes or accusations of cheating. "So he had a pattern," Hank observed. Exactly, but that's not all. Hartman selected another document. This is a statement from a witness at Bitter Creek who survived the fire, a bartender named Joseph Collins. He specifically recalled seeing Blackwell knock over a lamp during the altercation that preceded the fire, and he believed it was deliberate. Scarlett, who had been silent until now, gasped softly. I knew it wasn't an accident. The way he smiled when the flames started spreading, he enjoyed it. Hartman reached across the table to squeeze her hand briefly. I believe you, Scarlett. I always did. But the most damning evidence I have concerns the Redemption Creek fire specifically. He produced a final document, this one a medical report. This is my official autopsy report on Emmett Blackwell, which I filed with Sheriff Miller. What I didn't include, because at the time I couldn't prove it, was that I found traces of lamp oil on Blackwell's hands and clothing. He'd handled the accelerant directly. And his position in the hallway, Hank prompted. Consistent with someone returning to a room, not fleeing from it, Hartman confirmed. He was found just outside what had been Scarlett's door, facing inward. If he'd been trying to escape, he'd have been facing the stairs. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of this evidence. Finally, Scarlett spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Will it be enough? Will people believe it after all this time? Hartman sighed. Some will, some won't. Sheriff Miller is a reasonable man at heart. I believe he'll acknowledge the evidence. As for the rest of the town, it may take time. Or a more public forum, Hank suggested, an idea forming in his mind. The evidence should be presented to the whole town at once, not filtered through gossip and hearsay. What did you have in mind? Hartman asked. Town meeting, Hank said simply. Get Sheriff Miller to call one. Present all the evidence at once. Let the town see the truth for themselves. Scarlett looked uncertain. I don't know if I could face the entire town at once. The way they look at me. You wouldn't have to say anything, Hank assured her. Dr. Hartman and I would present the evidence, but your presence would be powerful, showing you have nothing to hide. Hartman nodded slowly. It could work, and the timing might be right. Tomorrow is Sunday. The whole town will be gathered for church already. Then that's our plan, Hank said decisively. Dr. Hartman, can you speak with Sheriff Miller today? Show him your evidence privately before the public meeting? It would help to have him on our side. I'll go now, Hartman agreed, gathering his documents. Scarlett, are you comfortable with this approach? She hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. Yes, it's time the truth was known. All of it. After Hartman departed for the sheriff's office, Hank and Scarlett remained at the table, an awkward silence falling between them. Finally, Scarlett spoke. Elias is a good man, she said quietly. He risked everything to defend me when no one else would. I can see that, Hank replied carefully. You care for him. It wasn't quite a question, but Scarlett answered it anyway. I do. He offered me kindness when kindness was scarce, but, Hank prompted when she didn't continue. Scarlett met his gaze directly. But what I feel for him isn't what he hoped for, isn't what I've come to feel for you. The admission hung in the air between them, both terrifying and exhilarating. Hank found himself moving around the table to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Scarlett, he began, his voice rougher than he intended. I came to Redemption Creek with no intention of staying. I had no plan beyond the next town, the next job. But then I saw you, standing tall despite everything this town has thrown at you, and something changed. She looked down at their joined hands. I'm not an easy woman to care for, Hank. My past, my scars, they're always going to be part of me. Good, Hank said firmly. Because they're part of what makes you who you are, a survivor, a fighter, the strongest woman I've ever met. Tears welled in Scarlett's eyes. You don't see them, do you? The scars. Not the way others do. I see them, Hank corrected gently. I just see them for what they truly are, marks of courage, not shame. With deliberate tenderness, he reached up to brush away the shawl that partially covered her scarred cheek. Scarlett flinched but didn't pull away as he traced the ridged skin with gentle fingers. Beautiful, he murmured, leaning forward to press his lips against the worst of the scars. You're beautiful, Scarlett Juarez, scars and all. A small sob escaped her as Hank continued to place gentle kisses along the path of her scars, from her temple down to where they disappeared beneath her collar. "She's my treasure," he whispered against her skin. "Flaws and all, if you'll have me." Scarlett's hands came up to frame his face, drawing him up until they were eye to eye. "I'll have you," she whispered back, before closing the distance between them in a kiss that felt like coming home. The town meeting the next day was everything they had hoped for and feared. The church was packed, with curious citizens filling every pew and standing along the walls when Sheriff Miller called for attention. "Folks," he began solemnly, "many of you are wondering why I called this meeting. The truth is, new evidence has come to light regarding the hotel fire 4 years ago, and as your sheriff, I believe you have a right to hear it." A murmur ran through the crowd as Miller gestured Dr. Hartman forward. Hank stood at the back of the church with Scarlett, who had chosen to forego her usual shawl for the first time in public. He could feel the tension in her body as the townspeople turned to stare, but she held her head high, her hand firmly clasped in his. Dr. Hartman presented his evidence methodically, his voice clear and authoritative as he explained the pattern of fires associated with Emmett Blackwell, the witness statement from Bitter Creek, and finally, the evidence from Blackwell's own body that suggested he, not Scarlett, had been the one to start the Redemption Creek fire. When he finished, Sheriff Miller stepped forward again. "I've reviewed this evidence carefully, and I believe it warrants a formal declaration. Scarlett Juarez is hereby cleared of any suspicion in relation to the hotel fire. The case will be officially recorded as arson committed by Emmett Blackwell, with his death ruled as accidental during the commission of his crime." The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, Mrs. Whitley rose from her pew and walked to where Scarlett stood. For a tense moment, the two women simply looked at each other. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Whitley reached out to take Scarlett's free hand. "I blamed you because I needed someone to blame," she said, her voice carrying in the hushed church. "I'm sorry." It was as if a dam had broken. One by one, other townspeople approached Scarlett, some to apologize, some simply to acknowledge the truth. Not everyone, of course. Some left the church without a word, and Hank knew that not all minds or hearts would change in a single day. But it was a beginning. Through it all, Hank stayed by Scarlett's side, his hand a steady presence at the small of her back. When the last townsperson had spoken to her, and the crowd began to disperse, he felt her sag slightly against him, the emotional toll of the day finally catching up to her. "Let's go home," he murmured, and she nodded gratefully. They walked back to her cabin in companionable silence, the spring sunshine warm on their faces. As they approached her gate, Scarlett paused, turning to face Hank with a serious expression. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Hank knew she wasn't just asking about the immediate future. "Now, we build something new, together, if that's what you want." "What about the Rangers? Your life in Texas?" "I've been thinking about settling down for a while now," Hank admitted. "Finding a place to put down roots. Maybe Redemption Creek needs a deputy sheriff." A smile bloomed on Scarlett's face, transforming it just as it had the first time he'd seen her truly smile. "Are you saying you want to stay here with me?" Instead of answering with words, Hank drew her into his arms, kissing her with all the emotion that had been building since the day he'd first seen her standing defiant against her tormentors. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm saying I love you, Scarlett Juarez. Scars past everything. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much." Tears glistened in Scarlett's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too, Hank Valens, and yes, I'll have you, every stubborn, protective inch of you." As they stood together in the golden afternoon light, Hank knew with absolute certainty that he had found something more precious than he'd ever thought possible in this small Montana town. Not just love, but a home, a future, a treasure worth fighting for. In the months that followed, Redemption Creek slowly began to live up to its name. Hank did indeed become deputy sheriff, working alongside Miller, who proved more reasonable once freed from the burden of the unsolved fire. Scarlett expanded her garden, selling her vegetables and herbs at the general store, which now treated her fairly under its new management. the previous owner having retired under something of a cloud after the truth about the fire emerged. Dr. Hartman returned to Denver, but not before giving the couple his blessing and extracting a promise from Hank to take care of the most remarkable woman in Montana. It was a promise Hank intended to keep for the rest of his days. A year to the day after Hank had first ridden into Redemption Creek, he and Scarlett were married in the same church where her name had been cleared. Mrs. Whitley baked the wedding cake, Mr. Peterson gave the bride away, and Sheriff Miller stood as Hank's best man. Not everyone from town attended. Some wounds heal slower than others, but enough came to show that true redemption was possible, even in a place where memories ran long and deep. As Hank kissed his bride before the gathered witnesses, his fingers gently traced the scars on her cheek, scars that were no longer hidden, no longer a source of shame, but simply part of the woman he loved beyond reason. "My treasure," he whispered against her lips, feeling her smile against his, "forever and always." And in that moment, with the afternoon sun streaming through stained glass to bathe them in colored light, both Hank and Scarlett knew they had found something that many search a lifetime for and never find a love strong enough to overcome the past, brave enough to face the future, and deep enough to heal even the most profound scars. Redemption, they had learned, wasn't just the name of a town. It was what happened when two wounded souls found each other and chose to build something beautiful from the ashes of their past.